Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our very special guest tonight, Professor John Bellamy Foster. Professor Foster is an American professor of sociology at the University of Oregon and editor of the Monthly Review. He writes about political economy of capitalism and economic crisis, ecology and ecological crisis, and Marxist theory. Professor Foster, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We've been discussing capitalism, and of course, a lot of focus has been on finance and globalization. We have been trying to cover that from various angles: austerity, export of capital, debt, etc., etc. You have been at the center of theorization of monopoly capital. For our viewers who might not be familiar with the idea, building on Baran and Swiss's original idea about monopoly capital, that the 20th century American capitalism is dominated by giant corporations which squeeze a lot of surplus profits, which cannot be necessarily plowed back effectively into the system, which leads to economic stagnation. I'm very curious, and then there are various counter mechanisms to resolve some of these contradictions, imperialism, fiscal stimulus, etc., etc. Your work focuses on finance and also ecological destruction. I'm curious if you were to tell us about how you look at the core of global capitalism today. What would be that structure of global capitalism where you would focus on?
Well, I guess I would start with the notion of globalized or global monopoly finance capital. I mean, this is really a development on Marxist theory from the time of Marx and Lenin to the present. So Marx talked about the concentration of centralization of capital as a dominant tendency. He did not live to see the development of monopoly capitalism, which came at the very end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But we saw the emergence of giant corporations as crucial elements in capitalism, and Lenin in particular uh, associated this with imperialism and said imperialism, in the briefest possible definition, is the monopoly stage of capitalism. That is the growth of concentrated capital and its global thrust. And he connected that too to the growth of banks, to the growth of finance capital. And in many ways, we've seen in the later parts of the 20th century and in the 21st century, we've seen that develop further. And so, we often talk about monopoly finance capital now because the giant corporations are very integrated with finance now. They're essentially financial entities, and the distinction between manufacturing capital or industrial capital and financial capital has somewhat disappeared. They've blended together in fundamental ways. So we talk about monopoly finance capital, but we're still in, this is a new phase of the monopoly stage of capitalism. And of course, it's more globalized. These corporations became multinational corporations in the second half of the 20th century, and now we think of them as global corporations straddling the world. And we've also seen, the growth of private equity and with the concentration of wealth, individuals, billionaires, are now much more powerful than ever before in governing the capitalist system and operating by themselves or through private equity, not simply through corporations, not simply through publicly traded corporations. And we've seen new forms of unequal exchange, new forms of exploitation and expropriation of the global South economically, and of course the increased economic development in parts of the global South, the emerging economies. China stands out in this respect, and India in a different way. And so we're seeing a shift where the imperialist world system is still governed by the old imperial powers, the same ones that Lenin pointed to in 1916, are still the leading imperial countries. The Group of Seven, for example, they're all listed as principal, except for Canada, as the principal imperial powers in Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So they're still there, but the United States, Europe, and Japan are not as, which we also call the triad, they're not as dominant as they were before. The power is receding, their economic power, and as a result, we see decline of empire, particularly decline of U.S. empire, the growth of militarism, or resurgent militarism, because that's the one power basis that the countries, the imperial powers still predominate in, and and we're seeing the growth of neofascism across the advanced capitalist world, the decline of liberal democracy. And in some ways, it resembles some things that have problems that have arisen politically in the global South as a result of imperialism. But now, ironically, a lot of these same kinds of corrupt political formations are now appearing in the global North too, and a resurgence of neo-fascism. And of course, we have the planetary environmental crisis, which is an existential crisis for all of humanity, and increasing dangers of thermonuclear conflict, which is another existential crisis. So we're in a very difficult time, but the difficulties themselves, I think, are creating new movements and consolidation of movements throughout the world, and particularly in the realm of anti-imperialism. And in that realm lies hope.
You said something about the blurring of distinction between the corporate giant corporations, which might be classified very sharply as finance corporation and other corporations. And I was thinking about, as you said, I was thinking about a BlackRock having controlling massive amount of shares within Apple, as fitting to some of that kind of description. So we are seeing a huge nexus between Wall Street and Silicon Valley to that effect. In this regard, I'm sure you know there is this emergence of a literature focusing on, or let's call it techno-feudalism, popularized by Yanis Varoufakis. We discussed his book, and as I read it, it makes some sharp distinctions. One is between rent and what they describe as profit. The other is probably between manufacturing capitalism versus finance. I'm very curious about what are your thoughts about this new kind of categories like techno-feudalism, and to the extent that they even claim that this is very distinct from the earlier versions of capitalism, and some would even go further in saying that we are not even perhaps living under capitalism. What's your thoughts on that kind of literature?
Well, Varoufakis has been a friend, and his economic analysis, much of his economic analysis is excellent and overlaps with ours at Month Review. In fact, he's very influenced by the monopoly capital argument. But the the notion of techno-feudalism, I think, is a diversion from a critique of capitalism. It's not well historically based. The notion of, I mean, we're not in a feudal era, and we can't see it as somehow technology imposed on some kind of uh, feudal parcelized sovereignty, right? Or yeah, we're I mean the it has a certain kind of attraction to people, the notion of techno-feudalism, because the tech giants and billionaires are very prominent, and they're they're presenting themselves almost like feudal lords and so on. But all that is a diversion from the realities of capitalism, the evolution of capitalism, and it's really part of a social democratic argument that wants to kind of solve the problem by um, by confronting the tech giants and the billionaires and getting back to the good old liberal order of or our social democratic order of the so-called golden age of capitalism after the Second World War. And I think that that's a mirage. We can't go back to that. We shouldn't go back to that. The only way of going forward is to confront capitalism itself. But by avoiding the question of capitalism and monopoly capitalism, you essentially set up a politics that's social democratic, and that doesn't really confront the world system, which is such a disaster. It doesn't confront imperialism, and it doesn't raise the issue of revolution, which revolutionary scale change, which is what the world needs now simply for survival.
I when you said this harking back to golden age of capitalism, as someone from the global south, particularly let's say India, which is not China, which has seen massive amount of transformation within reform and opening, one of the things that I've often thought about this literature is why hasn't this literature gained traction in the global south? And one of my hypotheses is that we haven't had that phase of golden age of capitalism, and that also ties to some of my critique of traditional Marxists from Global South, who thinks that the post-decolonized pre-reform opening as something relatively progressive. I understand it was progressive than the phase of traditional colonialism, but nevertheless, that phase of capitalism was highly extractive, based on extremely informalized labor, with no real improvement in standard of living. And it is very hard for people like us to go out into today's working class in India and say that, look, 30 years before the reform and opening, life was good for you. And they were like, when was this good life for us? And so even though life after reform and opening in places like India has not been good at all, but it's very hard to distinctly show a very sharp decline. I mean, one can focus on sectors and say that, of course, there has been a layoff in those segments, but the general conditions of life there doesn't seem to exist. There's clearly there doesn't exist this golden age, and I think that's where the location of this literature is in the West, where there seemed to be that kind of welfare capitalism or Keynesian capitalism that at least catered to some sections of broader middle class, working class life.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The notion of the global, I mean, of the golden age of capitalism originated with thinkers and economists in the United States with a sort of social democratic emphasis, like Stephen Margolin and Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis. They all pervaded the notion of the global age, the golden age of capitalism, and this was this was the period that what they call the golden age was the period of the Korean War and the Vietnam War, where the United States economy was prospering really on the back of regional wars in Asia more than anything else. And from our standpoint, from a monthly review standpoint, that was never something that you could reasonably call a golden age. But the term has proliferated, and there is some sense to it, not in that exaggerated way, but it is true that during that period, the world economy was growing, and it had come out of the Second World War and the Great Depression and the Second World War, and there was a period of relative prosperity, which then turned into stagnation and neoliberalism and so on. But the global South didn't ever really experience that prosperity as a whole. And and it's true that in that period, there was politics were more progressive. They were more progressive in the United States than today. They were more progressive in India than today. So we tend to look back at that and see, well, that was a better period. And also income and wealth were more equal then than now, whether you look at the United States or India. So in that sense, it seems to be a little bit better period. But we can't go back to that. I mean, it was the contradictions of that era that produced the period that we're in, and the 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 illusion that somehow we can move away from techno-capitalism or um, uh, monopoly capitalism. The term rent is, the emphasis on rent is really a way of talking about monopoly, and maybe in a little bit more liberal, in softer terms, right? But it's all about expropriation, and we can't go back to that earlier period, and it's the contradictions of those years that produced the stagnation, the financialization, the globalization, and finally the demise of the liberal democratic state and the rise of neo-fascism that we see today, the decline of the global order. So it's a really a very unhistorical materialist way of thinking to somehow say, oh, it's some combination of technology and feudalism. Let's forget about capitalism. And we can go back to the better capitalism of 30 years ago. No, that's an illusion. And it turns us away from the very serious crises that we have today in the need for social organization.
I want to discuss a little bit about your writing in the monthly review on MAGA, and one of the claims, and I agree with you completely. We have been making similar claims. Is that this idea? I mean, I'm not even sure how many people now believe in that, but this idea that MAGA is opposed to militarism and it is for peace is a hoax, is an illusion. And you mention Christian parenting in your article. If you could tell our viewers why did you write that article? What was the need for you to write that article to even explain that MAGA doesn't stand for peace as it suggests?
Well, I actually wrote three articles. I'm trying to remember the names of all of them, but one is was the U.S. ruling class and the Trump regime, which I think was in April, last April. Then I wrote one on Ma MAGA ideology and the Trump regime, and then I wrote one on the Trump doctrine and the new MAGA imperialism
Yeah,
in June.
this is the one I
This
read.
is the one you're asking about, and what I realized that I mean this goes back because I wrote a book on Trump in the in 2017 when the first Trump administration rose. I wrote a book called Trump in the White House, and where I was explaining how Trump was actually tied to a neo-fascist movement. And the problem with understanding fascism is that the original notion of fascism came from Marxism. I mean, even in the Nuremberg trials, they use Franz Newman's Behemoth, uh, which is a Marxist account of fascism, to explain what fascism was. And the Marxist understanding of fascism was always a class-based definition. But Marxists stopped dealing with fascism in the for quite a time, and then liberal historians took over and started redefining fascism as just ideology, not related to class, not related to anything, just an ideology of racism and so on. And this actually started with the Frankfurt School with their Horkheimer and Adorno's the authoritarian personality. But liberals rewrote what fascism was just as a kind of right-wing ideology and totalitarianism with no class analysis, completely removed from a historical materialist approach. So, in trying to explain the Trump phenomenon, I went back to explain neo-fascism, the roots of his movement, of the movement that he is the titular head of in class terms. And so, I mean, this means that it's traditionally it's an alliance. Fascism is an alliance between core sectors of monopoly capital and the petty bourgeoisie or lower middle class. And then if you start from that, then things start to fall into place. It's meaningful. Otherwise, they tried to, in US media, they tried to say, oh, Trump's base is the white working class, that he has a base in the working class. That's not accurate. It's a distortion in class terms of what's going on. So I tried to explain the whole Trump phenomenon in those terms. I don't know how much influence it had at the time, but when Trump got reelected in recently in 2024, I went back to explaining the rise of Trump and I decided that it was important at this point to explain MAGA ideology, which had built up in the meantime. They developed a very sophisticated ideology and political institutions that undergirded the whole return of Trump and the policies. So that was dealt with in the MAGA ideology and the Trump regime. And then the article that you're referring to, the Trump doctrine and the new MAGA imperialism, I tried to explain that the distortions in understanding of Trump's international orientation, the MAGA international orientation. I'd already explained that in 2017 in the Trump in the White House, but I went into much greater depth and specificity of how this new hyper-nationalist imperialism is developing. It's no longer a kind of a liberal global hegemonic imperialism so much as a hyper-nationalist imperialism, which is designed to use every means of power the United States has to resurrect its position in the world as a unipolar power. And of course, it's trying to turn back the clock in that respect. But that was what it was about. And of course, the Trump doctrine was actually articulated in the first, in the in during the first Trump regime, and now has been put fully into place. So I looked at the tariffs, I looked at the racism, the approach to immigration, the approach to China. I mean, combating China is at the very center of all of this. So that's what that article was about. And I realized that abroad it's even more difficult to understand this, but in the United States, even in the US left, the majority of analyses didn't have a class basis, didn't understand neo-fascism, and were not really familiar enough with what the MAGA movement was all about. And so they came up with all sorts of false conclusions. There are people like Christian Parenti, who was a important figure on the U.S. left, in U.S. left journalism, a well-known figure and son of Michael Parenti, and he even wrote for Monthly Review at one point. But he has moved over into the MAGA circles, uh, defending the MAGA movement, Trump's cabinet, and arguing that Trump and the MAGA movement are not imperialist, which is easily disproven.
How do you define the relationship between the ideologues of MAGA and the big blocks of capital, whether finance or tech, but the giant capitalists? What would be their relationship with the MAGA ideologues who might be very passionate about waging their war on immigrants or liberals, cultural values, etc.? Um, how do you define the relationship between the two camps?
Well, of course, it's a little complicated. The Silicon Valley billionaires and the main the main moneyed figures behind MAGA, people like Peter Thiel and others, they have financed a whole series of think tanks, which are the main centers of MAGA ideology. So you have think tanks like the Claremont Institute. You have the Heritage Foundation, the American Compass, and the Manhattan Institute, and others. They're all financed directly by billionaires, which I explained, by mega billionaires, people like Thiel and others, and it's all very clear. And they also have created book publishing companies or branches within the main book publishing firms, which the billionaires sort of subsidize, and so they and but the these think tanks then have developed the ideas primarily. Now there's a split in the MAGA movement because just the neo-fascist movement is always based in the lower middle class, which is probably the best way to describe it today, but or petty bourgeoisie, and this consists of small business owners and managers, low-level managers, and of course people people tied to evangelicism and the business centered in rural areas, but various groups. There is some component of the higher echelons of the working class, a kind of labor aristocracy effect. But the lower middle class is primarily white. It's primarily small business people and low level managers, white collar, and so on. And and they tend to live in the exurbs rather than the urban core or even in the suburbs. So this is sort of Trump's base. And this lower middle class petty bourgeois element is very radical in a right-wing sense, right? It's like a typical fascist, neo-fascist movement. I mean, this neo-fascism is part of the overall fascist genus, and they're not. They they can be quite critical at times of elements of capital, like finance capital. They're certainly very critical, extremely critical of government. They tend to be, I mean, they don't really attack the corporations, the lower middle class, but they do have a sense that they're somewhat downtrodden. They're on the losing end, so they're particularly anti-government and sometimes anti-corporate, and they're not very easily controlled. It's a sector of the population that's extremely nationalist, racist, revanchist, that is looking to the past. They're patriarchal, repressive gender ideologies, and white supremacist, and so on. And there's an evangelical element, but they're not really always in sync with the monopoly capitalist class, because they have different interests. They have their small business interests, their nationalist interests, while the monopoly capitalist class is about dominating the world. So what happens, and in a neo-fascist movement or a fascist movement for that matter, there's always the need to control that kind of base, which a lower middle class base, which can actually turn on the big capitalists in some ways. So they try to control them, and the think tanks are basically oriented at two things. One is, and the main purpose of these think tanks that have been set up is to create an ideology that is opposed to liberal democracy, because fascism is about, it's not an enemy of capitalism, it's an enemy of liberal democracy. So they allowing big capital to come in and basically control the state. But they also have the task of controlling and channeling this lower middle class movement base that the whole neo-fascist project depends on. So their role is to kind of channel that base in ways that and create an ideology that serves the interests of monopoly capital, the ones who are paying for these think tanks, um, and um, and diverts them from any attack on capital itself or any conflict but you have people like Steve Bannon or Laura Loomis who are actually these influencers who are in the more tied to the kind of base movement who are quite rabid and and often threaten Trump in a way, and his whole and the whole, and more importantly, they come into conflict with big capital. So the centers, the the think tanks are designed to sort of control them as much as possible. Now the lower middle class MAGA movement is directed against the upper middle class, which they see as, or professional managerial elite, which they see as the ruling class, the ideology at least that's projected within the think tanks classifies the professional managerial elite or professional managerial class and the upper middle class as the ruling class, not the capitalist class, but the professional managerial class is supposed to be the ruling class because they control the state. So the idea is to go after them and and not capital. But the petty bourgeoisie or lower middle class is also very anti-working class. And they see the working class as diverse, as poor. They're afraid of falling into the working class, living, losing their wealth and falling into that because they're not that far above. And they see the working class in very racist terms because the lower middle class is predominantly white. And so in some elements of what we call the lower middle class in other situations might be seen as working class, but they have differentiated themselves by way of wealth and position and they're very anti-working class. They're very anti-diversity because diversity stands for race and they want a white society. So this is sort of the dynamic. There are contradictions within the MAGA movement. The think tanks that are paid by the billionaires have the role of trying to keep it all together and creating a program that at the same time that will annihilate liberal democracy. Does this make sense?
Of course, yes. You mentioned about Steve Bannon and some of the sections of these think tank-led movements coming in conflict with some of the corporations. I wanted to ask you a follow-up on this, given there is this, at least an optics that sections of the MAGA rank and file people are against corporations. Some people say that that's very selective when it comes to big pharma, when it comes to Soros Fund. They are opposed to big corporations because it is in conflict with their own maybe evangelical beliefs or other cultural values. Segment of Steve Bannon would be segments of people who are under the influence of Steve Bannon would be opposed to even Elon Musk at the time when Musk and Trump were friends, but not necessarily because of everything that he does, but perhaps what he does with gene editing or some of his futuristic projects that is in contravention to cultural conservative values. Do you think that kind of anti-corporatism within the mega base is very selective based on cultural values, or is there a sense of general feeling against corporate America because perhaps they see that they have been extracting a lot of wealth and income from their own middle class that they thought should have been a generation before were probably doing better.
I I think that Bannon is actually a very sophisticated thinker. I wrote a lot about him in my Trump in the White House book in 2017. And he knows a lot of political theory, he knows about fascism, he studied European fascism and so on. And he really is a neo-fascist thinker. And he's not really anti-corporate, but he understands the class basis of the movement. And I mean, that's what makes him so influential. So, for example, he opposed Musk and others, including Trump himself, over the um, the visas offered to, to high
H1B.
level, yeah, the H-1B visas for primarily for tech people to bring them into the United States, and he's nationalist, and he says there's plenty of tech people in the United States who want jobs, and you've got to hire them nationally, not bring in foreigners. But this is very much the view of his base, of the lower middle class. They see themselves as being robbed, and so on issues like that, they will post Trump. Right now, I mean, the Trump administration went after Medicaid because that benefits the bottom third of the working class, and now they're going after Social Security, disability, some elements of Social Security it's more dangerous for them to do that. But if like Trump went after Social Security as a whole, he would have the Bannon and the lower middle class, the movement would oppose him as it would because the population depends on that income. So the lower middle class is very clear about, say, where they are in, well, at least in this movement. They're very clear about where they are in the class system, what benefits them and what doesn't. There are all sorts of measures being taken against immigrants and against the black population now. But that's fine with this lower middle class white movement. But anything that economically affects them becomes a problem. So right now, the tariffs are creating all this inflation. Inflation is going up, and electricity prices have gone up. Well, they went up by like 9% in a year, and that's because of the AI and everything, the building of the new data centers. But this, when inflation goes up, the lower middle class gets furious. And there is this, as the beginning of all of this was the Tea Party movement after the great financial crisis of 2008. And it was the lower middle class that was saying we shouldn't bail out the corporations. They were the ones who, and then the capital realized, oh, there's a movement, we can grab onto it. But they're very nervous about that aspect of it, that the lower middle class doesn't like financial capital because of interest payments, mortgages, and everything else that affects them. And it's very delicate in that respect. If that sector of the population gets hurt economically too badly, then there's a possibility that Trump's support will fade away. I think the MAGA movement is this neo-fascism is with us for indefinitely because of the decline of U.S. power. It's a factor of the decline of U.S. hegemony and how it's affecting certain sectors of the population that formerly benefited. But But I think that, yeah, Trump's movement is very vulnerable to economic um, moves that damage the lower middle class. So they're trying to kind of promote the hyper nationalism and say, oh, yeah, well, the prices will rise because of tariffs, but it's all about us being patriotic and defeating China and so on.
I also wanted to ask you about your thoughts on how big capital is adapting to the whole, let's call it tariff wars, but it's basically much more than that. It's the whole economic restructuring. I'm not even sure if it is against globalization, but it's definitely against some certain elements of globalization. I'm not sure if it is going back to that pre-globalization phase, given um, Tesla, given a lot of the hedge funds like BlackRock's operation in places like China, given the semiconductor industry, the Nvidia depending on TSMC, who in turn depends a lot on China. Uh, uh, it's very hard to think that they would want to reverse the whole course of globalization. At the same time, there are ideologues, the Stephen Meirons and Peter Navarro, who thinks that we can industrialize by imposing tariffs and extracting tributes from the periphery. And they also think that while doing all these things, we can also retain not just the hegemony of the dollar, but also somehow the hegemony of the Wall Street. And these things are in contradictions to many people who understand economics, but they seem to think that all of these things can be maintained at the same time. I'm curious your thoughts on how blocks of big capital, this includes corporations which are hooked into the global supply chains, but also those who are in the bond market, for instance, or the whole creditor class, which has an interest in periphery, in lending, etc. How are they responding to this whole Peter Navarro project of let's call them isolationist project for the lack of a better word, but I don't think it is isolationist. But I'm very curious how you are interpreting these events.
Well, I think capital is divided in somewhat over this and in terms of the strategy. They're not divided over the goals they that the Trump administration represents, which is its its goal is to reestablish U.S. economic hegemony in the world and to somehow um, uh, undermine China's economic development, which they see as such a threat to them. So the big capital in the United States is really the giant corporations. They're very dependent on their base in the United States, even though they're global corporations, and they're very dependent on the role of the dollar, and so they have a certain kind of economic nationalism. They recognize that the United States is losing ground globally. And so they're concerned about defending their interests, defending the dollar, and they're ready to entertain a different strategy that would achieve that. But they're nervous about some of the repercussions that are emerging. So if you think in terms of if go back to 1992, for example, right after the demise of the Soviet Union, Time magazine brought out an issue on beyond the year 2000. It was just they jumped the gun in celebrating the new millennium because the Soviet Union was now gone and it was also the 500th anniversary of 1492, which symbolized Western triumph and domination of the world. So they had this beyond 2000 issue. And the idea was that the United States would just continue to dominate the world economically and militarily. And there's this notion that U.S. Um, liberal, so-called liberal economic order, which was backed up by monopoly, but the liberal economic order with a kind of free trade would keep the United States in the dominant position in the world. And I remember in the 1992 issue, that 1992 issue of Time magazine, they said China will not be able to become an industrial power in the 21st century. Okay, look, that was 1992, and Time representing the kind of view of the US ruling class. But they actually believed that China could not industrialize, could not become a major industrial power. They would always be. And look at it today. China is the second biggest industrial power, the biggest industrial trader in the world. Of course, India's been developing too, although in a capitalist way, and inequality is greater than ever. But they thought that the United States was permanently set to dominate the world, and then that's all eroded. And they first realized it after the great financial crisis, when all the economies of the triad went down into a deep recession, and the Chinese economy went down and then jumped up again almost instantly, what they call a V, shaped graph. I mean, it went down and back up, and then they realized there's nothing. They started to think China was unstoppable economically, and they waited. They thought maybe Xi would be a new Gorbachev in 2012, and then it turned out he wasn't. And so in the first Trump regime, they started a new Cold War against China. And the U.S. ruling class is behind this because they realize that if China and the global South become too economically powerful, the imperialist world system, which their operations are dependent on, will cave in. And that's actually what's happening. So they're ready to go to war. And the tariffs are a form of economic warfare. And they're willing to try that to see if they can reestablish things. And the big plan was what's called the Malago, yeah,
Mar-a-Lago, Mar-a-Lago.
Mar-a-Lago, sorry, the Mar-a-Lago, it's the Mar-a-Lago protocol plan where they do to China what they did to Japan at the end of, well, in the beginning of the 1990s, that permanently destroyed Japan's economic trajectory by basically getting the country, using the tariffs to force countries to accept a reduction in the dollar on U.S. terms, and so that the U.S. dollar would become more competitive, and the trade in the global South would be destroyed in Europe, but the U.S. would be the big gainer. And especially they wanted to use this to overpower China. So they're using the tariffs. The tariffs are not really about any kind of economic logic. They make no sense to economists. They're basically big sticks to break down resistance of countries and get them to make economic concessions that will restore U.S. power. And so I don't think the idea of bringing manufacturing back to the United States is, that that that's gone. it's that's not going to in a period when the automobile manufacturers have parts which they get from 100 different countries, right? Where you have globalized production, the idea of somehow using tariffs to reestablish manufacturing dominance in the United States is just um, you know a utopian dream. It's not actually possible, but
Yeah,
um, but what they are doing is a kind of economic warfare.
yeah, it might be possible if the core periphery relationship is over and then cost of manufacturing becomes even across the globe, then, we are talking about a world that is much more different. But that is not allowed because uh,
Yeah.
in opposition to what dominance is. Um, I'm very mindful of your time, but I wanted to discuss China very briefly. I had a very specific question, but I don't want to start there. If you could tell us very briefly what's your general impression of China, having visited China and stayed there. I'm particularly very impressed with their ecological projects from all kinds of investments and developments in green technology, generations of green energy, but also the amount of forestry in the cities. That's what I'm very impressed with. But I'm very curious what's your general sense and impression of China is.
Well, that's a very big question, but I don't think of I mean there's the old question of whether China is socialist or capitalist, or whether you want to call it state capitalist or market socialism. I think I think is China today is something unique, that it's really a hybrid, but it's more complex than that. It's socialist led, and they have a kind of planning. They don't always call it that, but they have planning that is missing in the rest of the capitalist world. They have a connection between the Communist Party and the population, which is actually tighter and in many ways more democratic than what you have in the so-called democratic countries in the world, where there's no where the parties are just voting machines and nothing more than that. So China is very different, and I think that it's very successful. It offers hope to people, and it's really got the support of its population. Ecologically, they're very impressive. Now the biggest problem ecologically is they're still 60% dependent on coal as their energy source, but that's been going back down fairly rapidly, and they're the leaders in alternative energy in the world. They're the leaders in almost every environmental category that you can conceive of. They're now actually reducing their emissions, their carbon emissions. They're the leaders in reforestation and afforestation. They've done more to reduce pollution rapidly than any other country. So on all the environmental indicators, they offer hope where other countries don't. And it's I mean, certainly the core of the capitalist world does not offer much hope in these areas. In the United States, they've withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, but China is moving in these areas very fast. Their whole notion of ecological civilization arose out of socialism and is inconceivable outside of a society that's on a path, consciously on a path towards socialism. And there's a tendency on some parts of the left in the global north now to refer to China as imperialist. But of course, the that's hard to it's hard to make a case for that. They haven't been involved in wars except on their own borders for well, as far back as you can conceive, and they're they're allying themselves with the global South through the Belt and Road Initiative and in other ways. They're the leaders in terms of proposals for global peace. I think that China has got a lot of things that hold out hope for the world. There's lots of contradictions in China. There's a lot of inequality in China and so on. But it seems like China's addressing these issues now, while other countries are doing the exact opposite. So I have hope there, and especially the notion of ecological civilization, defining socialism in terms of ecological civilization and a beautiful China. Xi says that mountains of green are more important ultimately than mountains of gold. And who else is saying that? I think this is very important.
And China's ecological story is particularly more impressive if one remembers that not until very long in recent history, it had all kinds of bad parameters in every kind of ecological indicators. I mean, it's not the West where you had clean air relatively, green fields, urban cities are much cleaner, etc. China was not that. It was a typical global South ecology. I'm not sure if your time permits for my specific question that I had in mind.
I'm fine time
All
wise.
right. Okay. So, yeah. So this is what I actually intended to ask you on China. Given your work on monopoly capital, China, to my mind, seems very interesting in the sense that it has the classic 19th century terrain of multiple players, private players competing against each other, having the tendency to cut down on profits, leading to all kinds of problems that perhaps Marx was thinking about, introduction of technology, deep-throat competition, sometimes even falling rate of profit. So that's on one hand, against which Swissy and Baran kind of came up with big monopoly capital. But at the same time in China, we are looking at these giant platforms. And I just got back from China. I spoke to multiple people, some which are party members, very close to lower rung officials within the provincial cadre. And they've been very critical about some of this platform, blocks of capital, Tencent, Alibaba, and so on, and the conditions of working class within that. Um, I wonder, as someone who has contributed so much to monopoly capital, both theoretically, but also just looking at these giant blocks of capital, what are your thoughts about the rise of big blocks of capital in China?
Well, it's a difficult problem. I mean, to what extent does monopoly?
Of course, the state is extremely, extremely powerful. So I'm not making the case that the state has been politically hijacked by these big blocks of capital. Nevertheless, they have emerged as very giant blocks of capital.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it's a worrisome development in terms of if you believe in that socialism is about equality and democracy, how does that fit with these big blocks of capital? I think one thing is that the big blocks of capital, at least initially, emerged around export industry, and China was more relaxed about concentration of capital and allowing severe exploitation of workers, particularly migrant workers, within the export industry. And part of that was a calculated move to get Western technology at one point. They were swapping technology from corporations for swapping technology for access to the Chinese market with its incredibly low unit labor costs and developed infrastructure. So the profits for foreign corporations, multinational corporations, of producing in China were just enormous. And China used its leverage to get technology. But part of that was supplying migrant labor from the rural areas and allowing them to be paid wages that were really so low that it was kind of a super exploitation. Mainly people in their 20s and 30s, and then they went back to the rural areas. So there was some sort of safeguard, and they lived in dormitories, really terrible situation, but it was a calculated move to try to develop the state. Now, the question is, how much do they move away from that model in the export sector? But that created a lot of big capital. Now there's a lot of big capital that's being formed around AI, and that's seen as a necessity. But the the difference in China, I mean, there are a lot of differences. For one thing, is the land in the rural areas is still socially owned, still collectively owned. There's a very big state sector within industry, which gives the state leverage
Also
over
finance.
capital as a whole. And yeah, and then the state controls finance, which is crucial for the Chinese political economy as it exists at present. If they let go of that, they'd lose they'd lose control to international capital. But one thing that Xi has done is he instituted anti-corruption on on a huge scale, and not just momentarily, but he says this has to go on permanently. The notion is that corruption within the corporations and even within the party, this had to be fought, and it's really they're fighting kind of corruption that would be not even be considered corruption in the West, but they're fighting people using their position and political access to make fortunes, and that's really really important. They've kept control. They're really kind of keeping a control on the capitalist class by these massive moves in terms of corruption. And it's well, it's supported by the population. It's understood what corruption is, what this kind of economic corruption is taking from the society, and they're preventing that. So that makes it quite a bit different than what we're used to out, in the West or even in India, where corruption is rife, and you see billionaires in the West, and you know just how much corruption they've been involved in, and so there are and there's a kind of planning. One of the things that's different in China that and people don't realize is the degree of decentralization in in fiscal matters, so that there is a lot that's controlled at the local level. But that's also where they have to often watch for corruption. So I'm hopeful, but yeah, if capital becomes too powerful in relation to the state or in relation to the party, if the party, it seemed at one time that the party was just going in a capitalist direction, but it's certainly under Xi and even before Xi, this was stopped. And I think that socialism with Chinese characteristics is a real phenomenon, and I'm impressed by the brilliance of the coordination going in taking place in China, the politics, the policies. I mean, if you read Xi's speeches, which are well worth reading, you see, and other things coming out of Chinese government, but particularly his speeches, you see an organic development, an organic political development that is intrinsically socialist, is in charge and is flexible and is planning and is very strategic all the way along. So you know, I, as always, I always quote C. Wright Mills when he wrote "Listen, Yankees" about Cuba. He said, I don't worry about the Cuban Revolution. I worry with it." And I think I don't worry about the Chinese Revolution. I worry with it. And I could say that about some other revolutions too, like the Venezuelan Revolution. But I think I I still think that China is is struggling to stay intact, and there's so many things that are happening there that are good. But we have to be critical, and we have to be aware of contradictions, and we have to be aware of that things could go another way if we're not smart, if we don't, if we, if you don't, they don't talk about class in China much, but I'm sure Xi and the leadership of the Communist Party of China are very aware of the class relations and how they have a very narrow course to steer if they're going to reach the mature socialist society that they're aiming at.
We'll leave it there, Professor Foster. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much for your generous time and insightful analysis.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.